So, what establishment in the seminary professors? Calvin Seminary hasn't exercised theological leadership for years, except now a little bit with somebody like Jeff Wymont, leading it right. Okay, but you don't. I mean, that kind of gentle leftist leaning people. Who are they? And the Calvin philosophy department no longer has that. You raise Christian
James K. Smith.
James K. Smith, um,
But we're beyond the days of Mao and Plantinga and Walter Storff and
or take the denominational office. Zach King is now the head guy, but that thing went through a whole lot of changes and shifts, and there's very little power out of the central apparatus they don't have the money anymore, for one thing. It's the money is they changed the money system with predictable results, and so what's happened is that denomination is going differently. It's going differently in a profound way. And maybe that moment in 2016 or even earlier in, what'd you say, 2008, Paul, when suddenly you started to have this kind of little bit more organized thing. Maybe that's when it shifted. I don't know. But we're not in the same denomination anymore.
Well, and I think organized is one issue, but demographics is the other. And again, part of what I hear from groups that are sort of, Hesed, Reformed Journal, I mean, is still around, obviously in a much different phase. It is not what it was, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But again, I hear people dismissing, oh, this is a factor of organization. No, it is a factor of organization, but you don't get swings in the votes like this without the reflecting of the demographic. I also just recently had a video pointing out that if you go back over agendas for synod and you look at rolls of people going to church, for the vast majority, you never had empty slots in classical delegations. And this is for 2-week synods where people had to travel. I mean, it's interesting. I've been going through Acts of Synod, and all synods have this little note about basically, if you're going to drive, make sure you carpool, and please fly. I mean, this is all stuff that, Clay, you will very much remember.
Oh yeah, of course.
And but you never, I mean, to be able to go to synod was a high point. I don't know if my mother's father, Henry Osterman, I don't know if he ever went to synod as a delegate. He had been an elder in the church, but to actually, to get to be an elder of the church, now you've got status. And then to go to classis, now you've got even more status. And then to be able to be allowed to go to synod, I mean, for someone of my grandparents' generation, that really meant something. You were a person of status and consequence in your community. We've got 1 week, we've got free airfare, and you can't, Classis Hudson is sending 2 delegates to synod this year. Classis Hudson, when I was growing up, so one of the things in the 90s, I came back to New Jersey when I was doing my field work as a missionary in the Dominican Republic. And I looked around and thought, this Christian reformdom in northern New Jersey is a shriveling old person compared to what it was when I was growing up. And this gets back to, because Clay, you're right, you're sitting in Walnut Creek. There's no better example than Walnut Creek of this entire story. And so on one hand, it's easy to sort of say, it's a failure of your leadership, obviously, but you can't ignore, and I know, Clay, you tend to be prone to talk theologically. The theology of the left has simply not borne fruit in institutional Christianity. it's and culturally, and so
but
that's
now,
you know
now, Paul, you're absolutely right. If you're going to tell the story, you have to do the de-churching of America story,
yes.
as the framework over the whole thing. So and in part, what happened in CRC churches is that the whole mission board wanted to expand, 400,000 by the year 2000, right? I mean, what's happened to that? The whole mission board for all the time, they kept grabbing whatever was the latest and greatest. So you mentioned Bob Schuller. They're sending people to Bob Schuller. Before that, it was James Kennedy.
Yep.
James Kennedy, Coral Ridge Presbyterian, evangelism explosion. And this is where, again, it fits into that, where you move from the sincerity culture into the authenticity culture. I remember people that I very much loved and respected talking to me about how, you got to ask those two questions, one of which is, if you went to heaven today,
if you were to die tonight, what would you say to Jesus to let you into his heaven?
That's right. That's right. Well, man, that is so
there's a frame around that.
Right. So part of the frame around this is the fact that CRC churches weren't doing all that well. And so how do we build the denomination back up numerically? I mean, you can look at it in business terms, it was pretty cynical, but nobody meant it in cynical ways. They were all convinced of this. It was not, there were no bad actors in all this. It's just that what happens in CRCs, let me just do a little aside here. What happens in CRCs is that people like Walnut Creek, for example, is that people who are so the CRC styles evangelical, and that really got reinforced when evangelical churches moved into Pentecostal worship, of which Kent was. There's a part of Kent's story that we have not talked about, which is Kent as the worship leader. And Kent being there at
well, he does go to Madison Square.
At the
that
Calvin,
says something.
Well, and Kent is a pianist. He is he's a primo worship pianist.
Wish he moved to Sacramento.
Right. Well, I mean, I employed him for a while.
That's right, at River Terrace for a little bit.
Yeah. But so CRC styles evangelical. You go to synods, and there's a beautiful big organ up in front in the Fine Arts Building, and it rarely gets played at a synod. Maybe once or twice during the synod they bring out somebody to play the organ. What you have is a band, right? So it does worship the way evangelical churches do worship. It doesn't do it the way mainline churches do worship. It does it with a band and with whatever's on the latest, whatever the Christian radio station is in the area. They sing those songs, and that's. But when people get there for a while, evangelicals come. They get there for a while. They start to notice that there's something a little off about the way CRCs do church. They're not really evangelical. And so at that point, they often just walk back out the door because they say, this church is not what it says, what it advertises. That I see as a total failure of leadership on the part of the denomination, that the denomination kept putting people into, okay, this church is doing well, Willow Creek's doing well, let's go there. Saddleback's doing well, let's go there. And none of that was actually CRC in any real sense. Maybe the covenant people figured out how to do that in a way that they could retain covenantalism or whatever. And
they're big box evangelicals.
Yeah, they're big box, right. So then let's go back to that thing about the mainline churches. What's happened to mainline churches?
One question, and maybe you can come back to this. I don't know if this is the right time to ask it, but to me, though, there is a sense of resurgence in returning to kind of those original, those ways of worship and being church that were characteristic of what, say, Third CRC was in the 70s and 80s. I'm thinking specifically, I listened to the podcast, The Messy Reformation. I don't know if the two of you have listened to that, but, Jason, I think his last name is Rice. I don't know how to pronounce it, but,
Reyes.
he's interviewing pastors all over the Midwest. And it's such an important glimpse into the transformation that's going on in these churches. And it is a transformation. And he's interviewing pastors who are smoking meat all day Saturday, sitting on the patio reading Bavinck, and the organ is played Sunday morning, and I do think there is a subset of churches that not only didn't go that direction, but is actively going the opposite direction now. And it's being led by guys in their 30s who are, reading Piper and reading Bavinck and reading Kuyper.
Yep.
Anyway, I didn't want to stop and bypass that, but continue.
No,
Yeah.
Kent, that is absolutely perfect. That's exactly where I was going. So the fact is that mainline churches have gone down, right? I mean, they've lost, and they're continuing, I think, still.
Yeah, they're in a free fall.
I don't know that they're in a free fall, though. That's what I think. So I go to Episcopal churches a lot when I'm not preaching, and I go to Episcopal churches that look to me like they're growing. And that there is a kind of enthusiasm there, a sense of identity in those churches. And overall, maybe the Episcopal Church is still going down, but I don't think it's a free fall. I think that there's been a kind of settling over the last while of churches and people trying to figure out, okay, now, how do we do church in a post-evangelical time? And in some ways, the evangelicals have helped out because they've gone whole into right-wing politics, and there are a lot of people that just can't abide the church going wholesale into. I mean, maybe this is a mistake that the left made in previous generation. They kind of went whole hog into a certain kind of liberal politics, and that turned people off, and they walked. They said, no, church should be about other things than that. And now I think maybe some of that's happening in the other direction. But what the CRC has failed to do is to articulate a reason for anybody to be CRC that is intrinsic to the actual tradition of which we're a part, and taking into that tradition Bavinck and Berkhoff and Kuyper and Calvin and so forth, but being able to and the confessions, and be able to understand those confessions in terms of a historical flow rather than weaponizing them to go after Christian Demey or something.
Well, I think I agree with Kent in terms of, I look at these, how can I say this? There have always been sort of two Kuypers. Let's use Kuyper. If you've got one group that, when I went to Calvin, to be Kuyperian meant to be a transformationalist. And implicit in that transformationalism was a liberationism. And so that was the Kuyper that I heard, we want to be Kuyperian, we're going to go to movies, we're going to transform culture, we're going to turn our back on the pre-Second World War Christian Reformed Church. Now, I think, and then there's the other Kuyper, let's say the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, that looks at Kuyper and says, no, it was, okay, Chuck Colson. Let's get into it, the Chuck Colson chair at Calvin Seminary. So then there's the conservative Kuyper. And so in this way, people are looking at two different Kuypers. And what was remarkable is what's been visible in the last two synods. And what I think, again, many in the Reformed Journal camp, the 12, again, Pro-Felicity is not just Herb wearing overalls. Prophilicity is the, continuing sort of, the continuing sort of diminishment of the banner. It's been sort of what's happened to the Reformed Journal crew in terms of the denomination, and the fact that Calvin finally has a professor that wrote a book on the New York Times bestsellers list. And what is happening here is that the people coming into the denomination are, again, they're reading Piper. They went to his conferences. They are actually reading Bavinck, or they're reading Piper. They're actually reading Kuyper and Bavinck in their own way as reactions to modernism. So again, this modernist fundamentalist thing continues to work through the system. They are looking to have a confessionally reformed experience. Now, for many of these young pastors, and I'm going to name my friend Tim Blackman. What was so amazing to me with Tim Blackman in our denomination, he was again and again sort of platformed by the denomination because, well, he's not, is Tim Blackman Dutch? He's far Dutcher than I ever will be because he's from the Netherlands. He's extremely articulate, very smart, extremely well read. And what was so amazing, when people would keep platforming Tim, I would keep thinking, they really don't know how conservative he is. But there's a conservatism that Tim has, which is tremendously Dutch, because he is Dutch. He grew up in the Netherlands. His father left the United States, escaping Jim Crow. So there's a narrative that the racial reconciliation tribe can get behind. He married a Dutch woman, so there's interracial marriage. He then becomes a Christian, and he becomes a young, restless, and reformed Christian in many ways, but extraordinarily well-read. And some might say, well, why isn't he in the PCA? And that's probably a pretty good question. And someone might look at a bunch of other people who have fairly high profiles on the CRC right, and they might say, why aren't they in the PCA? And I think many of them that would say, well, the PCA might have been a viable option, but like, someone might have said about Tim Keller, why wasn't he in the CRC? Because Keller, if you'd look at Keller, he would often read Plantinga and Waltersdorf and cite Bavinck and Kuyper. And this is the crew that's there. And so again, what I see this as is when, let's say that the old Princeton broke up and Westminster, Philadelphia was established, where was the majority of the CRC? Who were they aligned with primarily? They were aligned with Westminster East, but they didn't quite fit OPC. That was a little too narrow, a little too restrictive. And they tended to lean a little bit more, again, this Dutch open. And what I see happening is that the Christian Reformed churches actually managed to attract people not from our colonies who temperamentally, in some ways, approximate that kind of conservative, self-consciously confessional, and that's exactly what they're looking for.
So Paul, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm not a conservative in that sense, but I am looking for that kind of quality of discussion, of theological discussion. I don't do. You and Kent do the sociological stuff, the kind of history of the church, that sort of thing. I mean, I dabble in that, but that's not what I do. What I do is theology and scripture, and that's what and I think there's a huge area that we could have a discussion. But if the church splits, as it looks like it will, Or if they, I mean, maybe it won't split, maybe they'll just sort of carve off Grand Rapids East or whatever. If that happens, that quality of conversation, what was the term you used? It was the kind of temperamental setting of the CRC will be lost. And
Yeah.
to some extent, it is a temperament more than anything else. I remember going to attending on behalf of the CRC, I think, an evangelical Presbyterian synod, and when they did things, they had it. Whereas this, it looked like legal documents. CRC would never do that. CRC was never legalistic in that sense.
It was familial.
It was familial. That's what I want us to just stop for a moment and say, for Synod 2024, just stop for a minute and say, what are we losing here? And what we're going to be losing is exactly that, so that maybe Tim Blackman and I could have a conversation about theology, and do that, over and then maybe disagree profoundly, and walk away and still say we belong to the same denomination.
And that's that's the kind of temperament, that's the kind of denomination that's going to continue to produce people like Nicholas Walterstorff and Alvin Plantinga and Kristen Dumais and all these people that, can do their best work within this kind of framework. And they couldn't do that kind of work in if we split in that other framework. The boundaries are too hard. They're not porous enough to kind of let in things from the outside in the best way. That's what I fear.
And Nick and Al Plantinga, Nick Walterstorff and Al Plantinga needed, in some sense, Calvin to be a place where they could develop their thought enough so that then when Nick went to Yale and Al went to Notre Dame, they could survive it. If they had just stayed at Yale and or gone to Notre Dame and Yale without that Calvin experience, they would not have had the grounding. We need that quality of conversation that we're losing.
Okay. And now I think you started off, Clay, talking about a failure of leadership. And I think right now in the left, we have a significant failure of leadership, because what do you do when you find yourself heading towards something you don't want? You're going to have to take a problem and figure out how to turn it into an opportunity. And I think it would have been better if we had done this a few years ago, but I think there are still ways to turn this into an opportunity, because the groups of churches that are probably going to start being put out, these groups of churches need to get ahead of being put out and start to figure out, okay, how can we develop structures now? And these are structure people. These are people that have been working on structures and thinking theologically and doing all this for a very long time and being willing to play with structures. You look at Church of the Servant. That's a church that's sort of at the epicenter grew out of that moment at Calvin with Nick Walterstorff. And, these people know how to do structure. They know how to do institution. They know how to think theologically. What they need to do is to begin to think, okay, I agree with everything both of you just said now in terms of what we need to do. And this is why I've been asking for a confessional conversation. It's a difficult thing to pull off. We're actually beginning to have one now. What we need to do is begin to have the kinds of structures that permit the kinds of conversations we need to have. And in many ways, we have not, for example, so the church by narrow margins approved women in office. That was in many ways the death of the conversation around women in office, because people didn't dare talk about it because they had something to lose politically. And so what you want is a structure that's going to be able to take the political off the table and say, beneath the women in church office question and beneath the human sexuality question are deep theological issues that we have to engage. But we're going to have a structure by which we can actually have these conversations without holding guns to each other's livelihoods.
And Paul, that is actually happening in many local congregations. You know, I've been in Walnut Creek for a year. I was in Beaverton, Oregon for 6 months. And there are conversations happening there about theology, which and people are very much disagreed about the big issues. You know, maybe not so much about women anymore, but they are disagreed about same-sex marriage and so forth. And they're not willing to blow up those congregations to engage those issues sort of directly. That they don't want to have a fight about that, because they want the quality of conversation and worship and other things that are happening that keep them together. And I can give you, I've been here for a year, and I can tell you that in this congregation, there are people all over the map about the issues that are exercising the CRC. But at the same time, every Sunday morning we get together, and when we get together, we look at scripture, and then actually we have a class afterwards called Talk Back, and we sit in this room, and it's not a very big group, but we sit in this room and we talk about our experience of being Christian in the Bay Area, and that's rich and deep. And I've had that, I preach in Linden. I haven't in a while because I haven't been there, but I preach in Langley, British Columbia. I preach in the Seattle area, Oregon, whatever. Crosspoint Church in Chino, California, which is a very conservative church in many ways. And you know what? In every place, the quality of conversation is good, and there are a lot of great people.
But we haven't. So I've got this estuary project going. What we haven't as a church done well is have a kind of conversation where that is in some ways open enough, but also not threatening. And
you're so
again,
right.
What's going to happen in Synod 2024, I think, is not hard to predict. We're probably going to have a tightening of the gravamen system.
Right.
There are going to be moves towards disciplining Grand Rapids East and or potentially other and local committees for other churches that have put talk about pro-felicity. They're putting statements on their website. Yep. And in many ways, there's deep issues beneath this pro-felicity question that are forced upon us because of technology, and we are relating in different ways because of technology. And we have to have those kinds of conversations too.
The challenge is that, I started writing the Substack a month ago, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from people on the right, very far right, people firmly in the middle, and people on the very far left. Almost none of the feedback I get from the middle and the left is public. It's always in the form of emails, lots of Facebook messages, things like that, because those conversations, to your point about being threatening, can't be public if there's a continual tightening of the way things need to be, because that opens people up to potential problems after Synod 24, 25, 26, depending on how these conversations end up going. So, I know, Paul, you've talked a lot about confessional conversations, but it's hard to have conversations, period, right now, because the threat level is just too high.
They're coming for me.
I don't know how to solve that, but that is the reality, and that's a real breakdown. We mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I can't remember if it was me or you, Clay, but the ability to kind of fight within the family in a different era, and that can't happen right now because there's people, at risk of losing ordination, and these are young people with families and churches, and what's going to happen. So those conversations can't be productive right now. And I don't know how to solve that.
Well, every Sunday morning at 9 a.m., you can come to Living Stones to an estuary meeting. Estuary is church adjacent. I have people who come, they have zero church background. Some of them are curious about church, but and so all over we're having people that are having productive conversations, and there are ways to do that. Now, we're as a denomination, I wish we were having these conversations a decade ago. I really do. But it was interesting when I first started talking about confessional conversations, it tended to be the CRC left that really didn't want it. And I think I got a lot of interest from the right, but not a lot from the left. And because, again, for the left, I had the sense that people thought, I have a lot to lose and I like the status quo because we think we're still pretty much in charge of the future. And I was telling them, I don't think you're in charge the way you think you are, because demographics are changing. And so I think at this moment now, where again, there is going to be a tightening, there is going to be churches put out, or at least the process of being put out. And we're going to see the Christian Reformed Church in some ways be similar to the church in the 1920s and 30s. And if you go back and read that history, I think you can see a fair amount of resonance than, let's say, the church, churches since the Second World War. So there'd be sort of a reverting back to an older form of the Christian Reformed Church in some ways. But I see so much brain power. I see so much capacity. When I in Little Sacramento look at Grand Rapids, because of the circulatory system, which is sort of, is sort of bogged down. And so you have a whole wealth of retirees in West Michigan with theological education, confessional knowledge, institutional ability, financial resources. I mean, Better Together went out and got a $1 million plus grant from Lilly. Abide has been doing things, on a shoestring, and
No
Abide's
budget.
still kicking their butts.
Yep.
So, I look at this and I look at the groups that are now have the guns being pointed at them. And I'm like, is this tribe gonna get a clue and be able to look at this now and say, okay, let's stop fighting the fight we've been trying to fight for the last 10 years and try and turn this disaster into an opportunity. How can we do that? Because the time is almost done. And they, I don't know how many Synod votes they want to lose until they think, what do we need to do? And I think there are some really interesting opportunities. I would like to see, and not a sort of a rush to the RCA, because then you're just going to get lost in that whole mess. That's been a long-standing fight. I would rather see churches try to become, let's say, an affirming CRC. Maybe you'll have 20, 30 churches together who will sort of they'll be in exile. But if they say, we've got a lot of institutional commonalities, can we broker deals across this divide to figure out, in this divorce, what happens to Calvin in this divorce? What happens to the pension in this divorce? What happens to all of these things in divorce? And the thing is, CRC moderates that I think are the ones who actually hold the keys here. CRC moderates, in many ways, we saw that last synod, want to keep the family together, but they are not trusting of what they've seen come down the pipe culturally. And I think that's part of the reason their votes have swung the other way. And so I think, these people have all sorts of smarts and brains, and they should, if anyone in the denomination can figure this out, they should be the people. And I'm just still waiting for them to say, okay, let's make some lemonade here. And I think that could be a really amazing thing. But I haven't seen anybody really take up the challenge.
Yeah, maybe that's the case. But so there are some very large institutional pieces of the CRC that are going to be challenged if the CRC begins to split. And one of them is Calvin, obviously. And Calvin is already challenged by that. I mean, a fairly small percentage of its budget comes from the CRC, but there's a long institutional connection. It's owned by the CRC, lock, stock, and barrel, and so forth. And the other one is World Renew, which has leveraged contributions into an enormous budget for development work in the world. And those two pieces, I don't know what happens to those exactly. I just contributed what for me was a pretty substantial contribution to Calvin, and that was just before the president got fired. And I'm hoping that place survives because my experience at Calvin was very much like Kent's. We came from a small town that was pretty insular, and you come to a place like Calvin, and all of a sudden you have people reading interesting things, thinking interesting thoughts, having discussions, and it was enormously powerful experience. Will that survive? I don't know. I'm not sure who takes this up. Paul, you're challenging, but it's not like there is a kind of establishment anymore. I mean, there's a few people that are retired, but who's going to do this? Calvin Seminary?
I think part of how leadership has migrated is we have to think more in terms of bodies and spirits than, I mean, yeah, back in the day, you would look to, you could look to some of the, I mean, it's amazing when you go through reams of synods, how many last names. I mean, Scott Greenway's grandfather, Leonard, being president of synod. And so, yeah, this familial network is not what it used to be, but I think I don't think the challenge. I think the challenge is that of vision, and I
agree.
And I've wanted to try to. I mean, I don't find myself. I mean, I'm in Sacramento. I'm not in a place to lead a charge in Grand Rapids, but maybe that's pro-felicity because what I see is a continual appetite to keep fighting this battle from the left. And I just want to say, you've lost. And when you lose, you need to adopt a new strategy to figure out, okay, what happens after the loss and to get on that page. And again, I don't think it's crazy given all of the familial connections, all of the relational networks that are thick in a place like Grand Rapids to say, or Western Michigan, to say, okay, so maybe we can't share a synod. Okay, let's figure out what we can and can't share, because both sides sort of like World Renew. Calvin, well, it's hard to figure out things. Okay, what is Calvin now? Calvin is not what it was in my grandfather's day, and not what it was in my father's day in terms of how it functions in the denomination. And it isn't even part of the circulatory system anymore. I mean, it's ironic that you had a hand and a heart that used to be the dominant symbol. It was the heart. It kept, pumping people around. Okay, so now we're going to have to recognize we're living in a different time, and what kinds of institutions in this age of pro-felicity do we need? Part of what made the heyday of the philosophy department at Calvin what it was is it sought to bless the world with something, and it did, and I think despite the fact that, okay, maybe what are the vehicles, what are the institutions through which we can bless the world? And I continue to think that in terms of the Christian Reformed Church, maybe it'll be divided into two. We still have a lot to bless the world with. And we haven't sort of fallen off the cliff with the United Methodists, let's say. Okay, so now we're going to have some kind of split going on here. But I think probably better than a lot of people, we have tools to have a confessional conversation. So even if there is a split, let's figure out how to keep talking after the divorce, because actually both sides need it.
You know, Paul, I think that's what's not going to happen. So what's going to happen? I mean, if I were just sort of predicting this, and I'm on the West Coast out here too, so I've no position to do this, but I would say that Synod 2024 or 25 or whatever is going to push hard enough to kind of push most of Grand Rapids East out. And along with Grand Rapids East, there'll be a number of other churches that will in some way join up with it. So we will have the Church of Grand Rapids East kind of thing. And Calvin will have to make a choice about where it goes here. And I don't know exactly where that's going to go. I have no idea about that. If Calvin, in fact, decides to stay with what's left of the CRC, I mean, stay with the CRC, what's now the dominant CRC, as you pointed out, they will become a very different kind of school, because they will have professors there like, oh, well, I can tell you that I think Kristen Dumais is on thin ice.
There's an overture from Minn Kota about not this exact thing, but kind of tightening things around the faculty covenant, I believe, which I can't remember the substance of that, but it's getting at exactly what you're talking about.
There's all kinds of stuff about, there's this kind of gravamen light that Calvin's Board of Trustees has in place. That's being attacked at 2024. So I don't know how that's going to go, because that's a whole institutional question and has a lot of legal aspects and so forth. World Renew, I think, could just step away without any problem at all, because their funding doesn't come from any kind of ministry shares. They are probably owned by the CRC in some kind of technical way, but they function pretty much as a independent agency, have for a long time. So then what will happen is that those two groups will not talk to each other at all. It will be exactly like what happened with the CRC and the RCA back in 1857. In 1857, a few churches decided they were going to form the CRC because those churches in the East were all too liberal. And they formed the CRC, and then for years, they lived side by side. In Linden, Washington, there was eventually 2 RCA churches and 4 CRC churches, and they didn't talk to each other.
Within 3 blocks of each other.
Yeah, right. From 3rd Linden, which is 3rd Linden CRC, which both Kent and I grew up in, you could see 2 other churches, that RCA churches, right? And then maybe in 100 years, they'll start to talk if they both survive. That's kind of what's going to go on here. And I don't think that the rump CRC is particularly stable either, because it's going to have to decide what its theology is, and its theology is Young, Luscious, and Reformed. It's going to be a lot more like the PCA than it is going to be like CRC, and so maybe that's kind of the direction that goes in. So, right now, denominationalism we could talk about that. Denominationalism, we probably should finish here, but denominationalism is itself in a lot of trouble, right? So there's a Presbyterian church, I have not actually gone there, but there's a very large Presbyterian church in Walnut Creek Presbyterian Church. It had a heyday in which it was a kind of mainline mega church. Then they had some pastoral issues and it went down. I mean, I know this because there's people here now that came from that church. And now it's an echo church, ECO.
Yep.
So it's left
Laura Smith's denomination.
Is that Laura Smith's? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So, but it's apparently on the rise again. I hear it's doing pretty well. So that's probably the future of CRC. It'll be Walnut Creek Reformed Church, or Walnut Creek Church. It's actually called Faith Christian Fellowship now. So it'd be Faith Christian Fellowship, and in parentheses behind it, a Reformed congregation. And it will not have an affiliation with the CRC any longer, but it will be in one of those denomination-like kind of things, you know.
Well, I agree with you that, I mean, the fact that the ARC, the Alliance of Reformed Churches, could begin with basically laptops and cell phones. And the denomination is selling its offices.
Right.
And I think you're exactly right. I in one of my videos, I pointed to John Baer. He's an English Bigo Orthodox scholar who, you know, even the Orthodox are asking questions, you know, what is the church beyond the local church? I mean, we are very much in that level, and a culture of prophylicity begs that question where, you know, again, it's super interesting that churches that want to signal their affirming stance do so on a web page. I mean, it's easy to sort of dump and say, we're going to pit sincerity against authenticity, against prophylicity. There's a way you can do that to sort of compare and contrast, but in many ways, each level has a legitimacy of its own. And you sort of have to understand their role and how they function together.
And they coexist.
Yes, they do. In all of us.
In all of us, in every one of us. That's exactly right.
Yep.
And that's the so we need we will get new institutional ways of being denominational, or we won't be denominational, but we'll have new ways of associating individual congregations with each other. And this is the American story, just kind of writ small, I guess, in that eventually we're all headed towards congregationalism. I mean, that's kind of the American way, but we do it by, you know, grabbing onto people that are like us, and then we have this little group and this little group. But the old kind of European-based denominations, denominationalism was invented in America because you had these kind of European churches which had to figure out a way to be church in a multicultural situation. That's ending. It's that long history starts with the Dutch. The Dutch were the first denomination in New Jersey and New York. The Dutch Reformed Church, that's where it started, and it's going to be done. And we will be the Alliance of Reformed Churches, or the ECHO, or there's a couple of them now for the Methodists that are, you know, so
Global Methodist Movement and so on.
Yeah. There'll be, you know, in the Episcopal Church, you got Anglicans now. God bless their heart. Who are, you know, if you're an Anglican in the United States of America, that means that you're conservative on the issue of same-sex marriage. That's what it means. And you probably have a bishop who lives in Uganda. So you couldn't have done that a number of years ago.
Well, I want to give Kent the last word, because I feel bad because he's on here with two preachers, and so to get a word in edgewise is really hard. So Kent, you get the last word.
You know, I don't even know. I don't know if I have a last word. I haven't thought through the future very much. I'll just say that. I think I'm more cynical than the two of you on the power of institutions. And you know, when I look at what folks like Abide are doing, regardless of how you feel about them theologically or ideologically or politically or in some other way, how they're doing what they're doing, I think, is a template for whoever's going to win. I'm not saying Abide's going to take the form of a denomination. That certainly is not what's happening. But my take is that group wants to, you know, I wrote somewhere when I overstated it and retracted it that they are anti-institutional. I don't think they're anti-institutional, but I do think that there's a sense where they're tired of funneling time, money, people, personnel somewhere and not reaping the benefits So I think whatever form the future CRC takes, it's going to fix that. For better or for worse for everyone, I think that is what's going to happen. But again, I haven't thought a lot about the future. I really don't know what's going to happen.
Nor do we.
All right. All right.
So,
well, thank you, Clay. Thank you, Kent. And thanks, John Van Donk, for initiating this whole thing. Little Wiener didn't come on. But I love John, and he knows that. And then, of course, John has been my partner in the whole estuary project, which has been, facilitating. Most of our conversations aren't churchy necessarily, but certainly God and, church, those things are always sort of in the wings of it. But all right, I'm gonna end the recording. So thank you both.
Thank you.
thank you.